Hey there, good evening, and thank you all for joining us for our True Talk Thursday podcast, the only platform that encourages a thought provoking conversation about topics centered around education. You'll hear opinions, experiences, research, and ideas from various perspectives. And tonight we have the great honor and privilege of featuring Hector Montenegro, who will be discussing trauma, resilience, and recovery. Driving the conversation, we have the Executive Director of ALAS, Dr. Maria Armstrong. Don't forget, everyone, if you like what you hear and want to learn more, tune in next week at 7 p.m. All right, Maria, take it away.
Hey, Hector, how you doing?
Hi, Maria. I'm doing well. Just staying safe and staying home.
Excellent. Well, first of all, thanks for agreeing to spend a little time to chat with me. Typically we have Atiba in the Zoom room, but they've got their conference prep tonight. So that's a biggie. I want to throw that out there for people to know that they're in the midst of their annual conference. Well, tonight, I really lean towards bringing you in on this conversation because of your background, your work with, Chile is always of interest to me, at least, and so I know it would be of interest to other folks as well. But you've been working with Castle for a while now, and our topic for tonight is centered around trauma, recovery, and resilience. So how about we have a chat about that?
Yeah.
So one of the first questions that people, talk to me, I know about is trauma now come to be such a frequently used term that it's a catch-all term, or is trauma more specific with depth and length of how people deal or dependent upon the trauma? Like, what's your thinking around that?
Well, that's a really good question. And in my years in education, both as a teacher, a principal, a superintendent of schools, that's been a sort of an evolving science because a lot of times we misunderstand or misdiagnose children with behavioral issues. We are just looking into brain-based research. I've been working with CASEL, the Collaborative for Academic and Social and Emotional Learning, for the last 10 years. And even there, the focus on social and emotional learning is still an evolving science, even though there's been a lot of progress being made about the learning environment and the way that we respond to not only our own histories, our own way of being, our own self-awareness, but also how we make responsible decisions that affect the lives of children. So when we look at trauma, trauma can come in many different shapes and sizes. We all have experiences where we've been traumatized. I remember experiences I've had falling off a bicycle, fear with a boogeyman, kukui, that could be pretty traumatic. In fact, the first time I heard the story of La Llorona, I was scared to death. I'm still traumatized about that. And so there are different degrees of trauma, and how it impacts on the brain and how it impacts on the body is very significant. So one of the things about trauma that we know is not only the magnitude in the degree that it impacts on an individual, but also the length and time of recovery. Do we have time to recover, to in a sense, put things in perspective? It's just like, the story of Santa Claus, you eventually grow out of it. La Llorona, you eventually realize, you need to pass on that story. But once you get over it, you realize, the nature of the story. But some of the traumas that we do experience on a regular basis it could be anything from a dog bite. It could be anything from a surgery or fear of a surgery. It could be a fall, issues regarding medical procedures, or perhaps different kinds of experiences that primarily are kind of one time, but they're not as intense, and which really has an impact, not only a psychological, emotional, but a biological impact on the brain and the body. There are other kinds of traumas that we associate with systemic or organizational or structural issues that perpetuate racism and perpetuate with inequality and perpetuate poverty within our community. There's domestic violence that happens, and depending on the frequency and depending on the adults around, that a child can be resilient and overcome those. That's kind of like a systemic type of thing. Homelessness. We see a lot of that happening with the pandemic. There's also microaggressions that could happen at home, in the community, and especially in the classroom. Discrimination, implicit bias, things that really impact on the emotions, and whether or not the child or the person has an outlet in which they can recover, then it really is not lasting as you would see more severe impacts, such as natural disasters. We see a lot of hurricanes and tornadoes in Puerto Rico several years ago. That Hurricane Maria was just devastating. We did some work in New York to help train teachers on how to deal with the children from the Virgin Islands and from Puerto Rico to manage and to be more resilient in terms of their experiences and loss with natural disasters. We have ongoing violence that may be occurring in the community in which children don't have that opportunity to recover. There could be substance abuse, there could be suicide attempts, or you could witness events that could cause emotional response, a very deep emotional response. And so we call these adverse childhood experiences. And this is where it really does have an impact on the developmental levels of the brain. It has an impact on the body. It has an impact on relationships. It has an impact on the ability of a child just to concentrate, ability to control impulsivity, ability to establish and maintain positive relationships, even that sense of fear and anxiety and how it affects the brain. It has these impacts on the child. And so we deal with what we call the ACEs, or child with high adverse childhood experiences, that they bring into the school or bring into the relationships. And now with virtual and remote learning, it makes it even more difficult, because children can literally escape. They may be on the screen, but they may not be attentive. They may not be attentive, but they're on the screen, they're being disruptive, or they may not even sign on, or they may be doing other things, multitasking, doing other things that really help them relieve the anxiety and fear and pain. And the challenge we have right now with remote learning, we don't have that sense of cariño. It's not expressed as well as we normally would if we were face to face. We can't have the individualized attention that we give children that need support, especially those who have been traumatized by scarcity of food, scarcity of housing. We have the fear of deportations. We have increase in domestic violence and so forth. And so we, as professionals, oftentimes are very restricted, not only in face-to-face education, but also now remotely, which makes it very, very difficult. So we're seeing an increase in more severe chronic type of trauma that children are experiencing, and it's going to have a lasting effect on our children.
Yeah, so, it sounds like when you talk about we all at some point have experienced some trauma, whether it's falling out of a tree, being thrown in the deep end of the pool, things like that are traumatic. Bullying, that, depending on how you were bullied as a kid, those
Exactly.
kind of things happen. But it sounds like you're saying, there were kind of one act kind of things. So you're able to, you have the capacity that as time goes on, you recognize it, but it's not holding you back, versus other long-lasting traumatic experience that happen over time, and the severity of it that really deepens the length of recovery, it sounds like.
Absolutely. And, everybody is different. So one thing may not affect an individual, especially people that may have been raised in a certain environment. There's certain environmental, cultural, and natural sort of circumstances that people are not afraid of. Like, there's some countries where there's snakes. I was in India, and they were doing, the charmers, cobra charmers, and they're not afraid of snakes. There are people that are deathly afraid of snakes or a spider. If a spider lands on them, that can be very traumatic, and it leaves an imprint on the brain, which results oftentimes in triggers. And sometimes, especially at a younger age, and you don't understand those triggers, and you haven't learned how to control them and how to be resilient, those triggers really literally control your life, because now you become more vigilant to try to avoid them. And then even when they come into focus, you can't control your emotions. You can't control your impulsivity. You can't control your, the fight, flight, or freeze response that we have. And so there are ways to overcome that. And this is some of the areas that we're exploring.
So then is it safe to say, or maybe it's just too quick on the ready to say, is post-traumatic stress syndrome then the result of a very severe trauma, as you said, versus the ones that creep up, or you have that trigger memory?
Mm-hmm. Well, we know that soldiers that are returning back from war do experience high levels of PTSD. And a lot of times it is related to the extreme nature of the experience, the constant bombardment of negative stimuli and fear factors. And so when we look at the degree in which a particular stimulus impacts on the person's brain and response and their ability to manage and cope, then we know that there is going to have to be different approaches in dealing with that. So like I said, that not everybody responds to situations the same. And because I've been in car accidents, and I can remember those as if it were yesterday. And it took me years to overcome some of the pain, the recovery period. But now I'm fine. I'm not afraid to drive cars, but it affects people differently. Right. Sometimes like these triggers can really control a person's life if they have not learned how to overcome them. But again, it varies with each individual. And we as educators, you had talked about the kind of the globalization of the term trauma. Every misbehavior, every impulsive reaction doesn't mean a child is reacting to traumatic experiences. It could basically be something very simple, as a child has not learned how to control impulsivity. A child may be have other kinds of needs and deficits, like perhaps the issues regarding neglect, emotional abuse in the home can be in a way traumatic, or it can create a emotional need, emotional response. So we can't be too quick to identify every irregular or impulsive behavior as having traumatic roots, but we need to be vigilant and careful about how we frame it and how we look at it and how we respond to it. And there are ways to set up structures in order to, we can't all diagnose psychologically. It really requires professional skills and professions that do deal with that. But at the same time, we as practitioners and educators in the classroom should be sensitive to trauma-informed approaches. And those give you tools in how to regulate our response as an adult to certain behaviors that actually may be triggers to us. So the more that we're able to control and manage our own emotions, then we can see things a lot clearer and how to respond to the needs of children, and perhaps in a way properly diagnose exactly what may be happening. Bullying, like you said, could create a fear factor, and fear factor creates a degree of vigilance and avoidance behavior, and it could be misinterpreted as some sort of traumatic experience. It could be just basically an ability or inability for the child to manage that fear. But once there's strategies such as restorative practices and the relationships have been restored, then children have that ability to return back to normal. But everything shouldn't be, identified as traumatic. probably more so now than ever, but I think, we have to be really conscientious about how we give a blanket definition of what, trauma is.
Excellent. And I love the fact that you touched upon some tools. We're gonna take a break, but when we come back, let's talk about some tools that the adults in the school systems could use, not only to help with the students, but maybe actually help themselves in the process.
Absolutely.
Hey there, and don't forget, if you like what you hear and want to gain some more insight into what school districts are facing now, then tune in every Thursday at 7 p.m. or subscribe below. We thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Have a great night.